Hey everybody, it's great to see you today. Welcome to Living Power, your online Bible study. We are walking through the Bible in a year. Today is September 17th. And I want you to know we have one more week in the Old Testament, and then we start the New Testament a week from today. So let's hang in there and finish strong. I have really come to appreciate and love the Old Testament going through this study more than I have ever before, and I hope you have too. Today we are going to talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, and we're really going to spend this last week in the Old Testament primarily covering these wonderful history books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And what I'd like to do today is give you some background. The reading is pretty straightforward, so I'm not going to cover too much of the story that you read. However, I am going to give you some details that are not in the Bible, and I'm going to give you some historical facts just to kind of put things in perspective as we kind of tee up Ezra and Nehemiah today. So let me start with the history. I'd like to give you a chronology of the book of Esther, and it just will kind of help us to put the timing of some of these important events together. In 539, Persia defeats Babylon and becomes this third world empire that's been in all of these visions that we've been talking so much about. In 538 BC, the first exiles actually return because God has placed on Cyrus's heart, the king of Persia, to allow them to come home. In 536, we read about some of the first attempts to rebuild the temple. And isn't it interesting that whenever God's people are trying to pursue God's plan, there is always opposition. And we have read a couple of times now that there has been opposition. That's, of course, the devil's trying to thwart God's plans, and there's been opposition to rebuild the temple. Then after Cyrus, there was another king. I hope I'm going to pronounce this right. Cambyses, Cambyses. And then it was King Darius. So that's kind of how that progressed. King Darius in 520 allowed the temple to be rebuilt. And in 515 BC, that's when it was actually finished. So I found that to be kind of interesting there. This was the time period of Haggai and Zechariah. They were the cheerleaders for being the messengers of God's word, that it was God's will that they rebuild the temple. Then came King Xerxes. And that was the story of Esther that we just finished reading over the past 3 days. So that's where that came into play. Isn't it interesting? The temple was already finished back in Israel when the story, the events of Esther took place. Then there was, how do you pronounce this one? Artaxerxes. I can't even say this correctly. Artaxerxes. How about that? We'll say that way. This was 458 BC when Ezra was sent to Jerusalem by this king. Now, Ezra comes, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about him in just a minute, but let me finish this historical chronology first, and then I'll tell you a little bit about him. He brings reforms, of course, and 13 years later, Nehemiah leaves Babylon and comes. I think he leaves Susa, doesn't he? And there's a picture. My cats are playing over there. I'm sorry if you can hear that. There's a picture that I shared with you today about all of these points on the map. And so I think Nehemiah came from Susa in Babylon. He returns to Israel, or comes to Israel, as governor of Judah. Isn't it interesting that he comes 13 years after Ezra does? So Nehemiah is coming in 444 and BC, and then he is starting to rebuild the wall. So there are different building projects we have to keep track of. There are different people coming at different times, and there are different kings in place at these different times. So I hope that's helpful. Let's talk about Ezra for just a minute. A wonderful man to study, critical to the history of Israel. He was a priest, a scribe, a teacher, a bona fide descendant of Aaron. And you could consider him the Secretary of State for the Jewish affairs from Persia. So he had a royal decree from the king. He was on assignment when he came to Israel. He was sent in 458 BC, and his job was to enforce the law, the Mosaic law. He had three things he had to do. He was responsible to study, he was responsible to obey the law and be an example, and then he was responsible to teach. So that's why he came, is because the king sent him to teach the people how to obey the law. I thought that was very interesting. Now, he had such power in his role that he had the power to appoint officials to enforce the law, sort of like a policeman, I guess, to enforce the law in the region of Jerusalem, because that's where he went. And when he got there, a lot of exiles came with him, and the first thing he was asked to do was to deal with the problem of these mixed marriages. Did you notice that in today's reading? Why in the world would he be asked to deal with the problem of mixed marriages? What is the problem anyway? Well, let's talk about that. The Samaritans are people that are living and in the region of Israel. They have settled in the northern kingdom, and I suppose have married people here in the southern kingdom, or the former southern kingdom of Jerusalem. Who were the Samaritans? Well, do you remember in 721 BC, the Assyrians came in and exiled the northern tribes. 586 BC, the Babylonians came in and exiled the southern tribes of Benjamin and Judah. The Assyrians transplanted their people when they exiled and kicked out the Israelites. They transplanted their own people from Assyria and had them live in the northern area of Israel. These are the people that became known as Samaritans, half-breeds, if you will, that intermarried with the people of the pure Jewish blood. And the law in two places actually stated, so God did not want them to intermarry. And the reason he gave wasn't because the other people weren't as good as the Jews. The reason God gave was because it would lead them into sin and lead the people away from him, which is exactly true and what happened. But if you're interested in where those references are, it's Exodus 34, verse 11 to 16, and Deuteronomy 7, verse 1 to 4. So evidently this has been going on, this intermarrying, for quite a while, and some people were even having children. So we know it wasn't just something that happened yesterday. And no one was speaking up until Ezra gets there and he says, oh no, this is against the law. We need to follow the law. So Ezra gives a wonderful prayer and concludes that the solution is divorce in this case. And I know when you're reading this, you're probably thinking, well, why was that an acceptable solution? I thought God was against divorce. Well, here's one way to think about it. If the women were Assyrians and converted to Judaism, then it was okay. Their marriages could stay intact. The families could stay secure. And it's not that Ezra was condoning divorce. What he prioritized as more important over divorce was obeying strictly the law. And so that sort of superseded the ugliness of divorce. So presumably the women and children who did not convert returned back to their pagan communities. And I'll give you a little hint. I think it's in tomorrow's reading. After the pain of the separation, the pain of divorce, the people actually later in Nehemiah 13, which you will read later this week, actually fall back into this practice. So Ezra is zealous for the law. He does the right thing by God, but we're going to see later that the people revert back, unfortunately. Now, that's it for Ezra today. Let's talk about Nehemiah. We start the book of Nehemiah in today's reading, and Nehemiah has a job, a royal job back in Babylon. Did you catch that? It's in Nehemiah 1, the last verse in Nehemiah 1, so it's verse 11. He is the king's cupbearer. Now, the king's cupbearer is a very treasured position. the king would only put someone that he completely trusted in this role because, in essence, the cupbearer is the king's bodyguard in a way, because poisoning would be such an easy way to assassinate him that the cupbearer tasted the wine and probably even the food before the king ate it. And if he lived, then the king knew that the food was safe to eat. So it was a position of great trust. Nehemiah might have even been a eunuch. And he comes 12, 13 years later after Ezra does. But didn't you find it interesting the way he had to ask permission from the king? He was afraid to ask, and we can glean that from the reading today. The reason he was afraid is because when you went before the king, it was inappropriate, probably on pain of death, to show any displeasure, to show that you were sad, to show that there might be any reason that you would be displeased with the king or a command that he would have given or a law that he would have laid down. And here he is, despondent. He's looking sad in the king's presence, and this is what the issue was. I suppose he could have been killed for just doing that, but he wasn't. Evidently, they had a good relationship, and evidently Nehemiah, I think this is the key, had been praying for days, many days before this. God opened this opportunity, placed it on the king's heart to ask Nehemiah, why do you look so sad? And in that very moment, right before he answers, he even says a prayer. To the Lord. Nehemiah prays probably something like, Lord, let this come out right. And it does. And the king grants him permission to leave. I thought it was interesting. The king said, well, how long are you going to be gone? It doesn't say, but Nehemiah probably said about a decade, 10 or 12 years. The king granted his request to go home. So this is 70 years after the temple has been rebuilt. This is about 446 BC. And this king, whom I'm not going to try to pronounce again, but it starts with an A. This king granted the request of Nehemiah. Not only does Nehemiah ask him to go home, but Nehemiah pleads on behalf of his people, just like Esther did, that the king would allow them to rebuild the wall. See, there are multiple building projects. This time it's the wall around Jerusalem. And what does the king say, yes or no? The king says yes. Now, why is this so important? It's because this was prophesied in the book of Daniel, in Daniel 9:25, that the king would allow the wall to be built. And the prophecy came through Daniel from God in 539 BC, long time ago. Now, I want to spend at least 2 or 3 minutes as we conclude today talking about why this prophecy was so important, where it fits into end times prophecy, and just what was the deal? Why was it so important? This permission that the king gave Nehemiah is critical to understanding something about the coming of the Messiah. Let me try to put the pieces together for you today. In order to understand, we need to understand that there were actually 4 commands to rebuild some part of Jerusalem, to allow the Jews to go home. There were 4 edicts that were given. The first was King Cyrus, 538 BC. He said, go home. You guys can go home and you can rebuild your temple. Darius in 520 was a second edict. Pretty much reiterated the first one. It was not a whole lot different, but pretty much he gave his permission for the exiles to go home and for them to rebuild the temple. So the second one was an agreement. The third one was, okay, I've got to try to say this again, Artaxerxes. How about that? I think that's it. Artaxerxes in 457, the same king that we're talking about. He had said, take money out of the treasury for the sacrifices. That was the third. This one that we're talking about today, that Nehemiah got him through the Lord's divine providence to decree, is the fourth decree. It came on March 5th, 444 BC is what I have right here in my notes. and he said, it's okay for you to rebuild the walls. What was such a big deal about rebuilding the walls? And remember, when Nehemiah comes and he comes to Israel, there's even opposition. What was the big deal? When you rebuild a wall around a city, it's almost like saying, we could revolt because we're regaining our power, and we could revolt against your leadership. And so this was a huge deal. This was even more of a big deal than them rebuilding their temple. If they can rebuild the wall, they could become independent at some point. So that's the issue here. Now I want to take you back to something that we didn't cover this year, because in Daniel 9:25, where this prophecy started, it fell on a weekend. Now in later years, that won't be the case if you're doing this Bible study in a later year. But if Daniel 9:25 falls on a weekend and we weren't able to cover it, you wouldn't have had this information. So let's go back to Daniel 9:25 in prophecy, and it talks about the series of 7. Do you remember that? It says, this is very, very important. The whole thing right here, you're just going to love this. So don't turn me off just yet. Daniel 9:24, a period of 70 sets of 7, this is not hard to understand, has been decreed for your people and your whole city, your holy city, to finish their rebellion, to put an end to their sin, to atone for their guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to confirm the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy place. A set of 7 is 7 years. We think of things in terms of tens. We learn math in sets of tens. The Hebrews learned things in sets of 7. This would not have been unusual for them. This 77s, 70 times 7, is 490 years. Here's how we break down the 490 years. One set of 7 sevens is 49 years. 62 sevens is 434 years. 7 plus 62 is 69. This period of 69 sevens, which is just 434 years, is what we want to talk about today. The reason it's important is because it says, the Bible tells us that from the time the command is given to rebuild the wall, rebuild Jerusalem is the wall. And it says right here in verse 25, 7 sets of 7 plus 62 sets of 7. This period of 434 years will pass from the time the command is given to rebuild Jerusalem. That timetable starts ticking when Nehemiah got his answer from the king that they could rebuild the wall. It happened on March 5th, 444 BC. I'm still reading in Daniel 9:25, from that moment until a ruler, the anointed one, comes. This is the anointed one, Jesus Christ himself. Now here's what's so fascinating. 434 years actually occur from this 444 BC, the time when Nehemiah gave this edict to rebuild the wall at Jerusalem, until the time the anointed one comes. When Jesus rode in on a donkey in Bethany, he was, in essence, declaring himself to be king. He rode in on a donkey, declaring that he was bringing peace. That was a common symbol of things that kings would do back then. He didn't ride in on a stallion. He rode in on a donkey because he was bringing peace. Guess what date Jesus rode in on a donkey when the people were waving their palm branches on that Palm Sunday? It was March 30th in the year 33, which was how many years after the edict? You got it, 434 years. Now, you can't count that in the Gregorian calendar. We count the Gregorian calendar as 365 days in a year. It doesn't work that way. You'll go, oh, she didn't know what she was talking about. It doesn't work. You have to count the years in the Hebrew calendar because they only count 360 days in a year. If you do it that way, it does come out right. This prophecy in Daniel 9:25 was telling us that their Messiah would come 434 years later, which actually occurred the day he rode in on the donkey on Palm Sunday. How do you like that? I knew you would love that. I just love that. I just love that prophecy. Now, I'll just tell you this and then we'll quit. The last 7 of the 77s is the 69th 7. That means there's one more 7-year period after all that has taken place. That period of time, that 69 sevens is 434 years. That's already taken place. There's one more set of 7 in the future that hasn't taken place yet. That's the 7-year period of the tribulation period. So we are in the church age today, and that marks the middle part. The 434 years, the 69 sevens has already taken place. We're living today in the church age, and the last 7 or period of 7 years, the tribulation, is future, and it has yet to be taken place. That's the easiest way I can explain what the 77s in Daniel mean. And I just think it's just so important for us to understand, but that's really, in a nutshell, what it means. We live in the church age, and there is one period of 7s yet to be fulfilled. Well, I hope that wasn't too much detail for you today. I know some of you just really enjoy that, so I know I do, and I want this study to be as complete a Bible study as you've ever had, so I didn't want to leave that out. Tomorrow we're going to continue in the book of Nehemiah. We'll be there in the next couple of days, so it's a story that you won't want to miss, and it will lead us up until to the transition that will take place a week from today as we begin the New Testament. Blessings to you and your family. I've got to quit. Sorry for going over just a little bit. Till next time. Shalom.